The boardroom went silent. It wasn't the comfortable kind of silence. It was the kind that happens right before someone gets hit by a bus they didn't see coming. My CEO, Vincent, sat at the head of the mahogany table with his hands folded like he'd just made the most logical decision in the world. Behind him stood his son, Brendan, wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage and a smile that screamed he'd never earned anything in his life. "Paula," Vincent said, his voice smooth as oil on water, "I've decided to restructure the leadership team. You'll be transitioning to a senior advisor role. Brendan will be taking over as vice president of operations." The words hung in the air like poison gas. I felt my chest tighten. My fingers dug into the edge of the table hard enough that I thought the wood might splinter. Everyone in that room knew what this really meant. This wasn't a restructuring. This was nepotism dressed up in corporate language. Brendan had been at the company for exactly 3 months. 3 months. I'd been there for 11 years. 11 years of building relationships, closing deals, developing strategies that made this company millions of dollars. And now I was being demoted so the CEO's son could play executive. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to stand up and tell Vincent exactly what kind of coward he was. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled. Not a real smile. The kind of smile a predator wears before it strikes. I forced my lips to curve upward while my brain calculated angles, weaknesses, and opportunities. My pulse felt like it was outside my body, pounding against my skin from the outside. Every person sitting at that table was watching me, waiting to see if I'd cry, if I'd rage, if I'd quit right there on the spot. They wanted drama. They wanted vindication for whatever they thought they owed me. None of them understood that Vincent had just given me something far more valuable than a title. He'd given me freedom. Freedom from loyalty. Freedom from protecting his interests. Freedom from pretending his arrogance was visionary leadership. I nodded slowly, stood up with measured composure, and looked Vincent directly in the eyes. "Congratulations, Brendan," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I'm sure you'll learn a lot." Vincent relaxed visibly. He thought I'd accepted defeat. He thought I was the kind of woman who would quietly transition into irrelevance. That was his first mistake. As I walked out of that boardroom, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about what I actually had. I was thinking about the relationships I'd built over 11 years. The clients who trusted me. The team members who followed my leadership. The investors who'd always listened when I had something to say. I was thinking about how none of those relationships were actually with the company. They were with me. And Vincent had just cut me loose. I spent the rest of that week observing. Not reacting. Observing. I went to meetings. I smiled when appropriate. I offered advice when asked. But I was really watching Vincent and Brendan move through the company like they owned it. Brendan made his first major mistake on Tuesday. He decided to restructure the entire client communication system without consulting anyone who actually understood client relationships. He moved everything to automated emails. No personal touches. No relationship building. Just templates and algorithms. I watched a major client, Thompson Manufacturing, worth $3 million a year, receive their quarterly update as a generic template. I saw their response. Cold. Confused. Considering alternatives. Vincent noticed the client's hesitation during a call. He panicked. He asked me for advice. I gave it. Specific advice that saved the relationship. But I made sure he understood it was extra work. Extra burden. Something he should be doing, not me. He was grateful. That gratitude was another brick in what I was building. Brendan's second mistake came Wednesday. He promised a prospective client a delivery timeline he didn't understand was impossible. I watched the team scramble to deliver on a promise that violated every operational reality we had. Vincent came to me again. "Paula, we need your operational expertise." I gave it. Again. But this time, I made sure he understood the cost. That this kind of crisis management would continue if Brandon kept making promises without understanding the business. Vincent was beginning to understand that his son was a liability. That realization was exactly what I needed. I started keeping a detailed journal. Every mistake Brandon made. Every client frustration. Every moment when the company stumbled under his leadership. I documented everything. Not as evidence for a lawsuit or a confrontation. I documented everything because information is power, and I was collecting power like coins. I also paid attention to the investors. 3 of them had been quietly expressing concerns about Vincent's leadership for months. But they'd trusted me, so they'd said nothing. Now, with me demoted, they had no one to listen to their worries. I reached out. Not aggressive. Just lunch. Just conversation. I asked them about their concerns. I listened. I empathized. I didn't badmouth Vincent or Brandon. I just listened and made mental notes of exactly what was worrying them about the company's direction. One investor, Thomas, was particularly frustrated. He'd invested $5 million in the company, and he could see it heading in the wrong direction. He asked me directly, "Do you think Brandon is the right person to lead operations?" I paused. I thought about it carefully. Then I said, "I think every leader deserves the chance to grow. Brandon's been here for 3 months. It's too early to judge." Thomas nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. That doubt was the seed I needed to plant. By the end of the first month, the structure of what I was building became clear. I wasn't going to fight Vincent head-on. That would be expected. That would be predictable. Instead, I was going to let Brandon fail. I was going to let the company struggle. And I was going to position myself as the only person who could fix it. More importantly, I was going to make sure the investors understood that I was the solution to their problems. I started attending investor meetings in my new advisory role. Brandon was usually there too, presenting strategies that I could immediately see had flaws. I didn't point out the flaws directly. I just asked clarifying questions. "Brandon, when you say the client acquisition cost will decrease with this new model, are you accounting for the increased complexity in the sales process?" His face would go blank. He'd fumble for an answer. The investors would exchange glances. They were starting to see what I already knew. Brandon wasn't a leader. He was a liability his father had created to protect his own legacy. And I was the only person smart enough to see the whole picture. I started building my team in the shadows. The best people from operations, the strongest account managers, the most creative strategists. I didn't recruit them away. I just made sure they knew I valued them. I made sure they knew that under my guidance, they'd go places. Under Brandon's leadership, they'd go nowhere. By the end of month 1, I had the bones of something. By the end of month 2, I had the structure. By the end of month 3, I had a plan that was so perfect it terrified me. There was a massive contract on the horizon. Meridian Industries. A potential client worth $50 million over 5 years. This was the kind of contract that would make or break a company. This was the kind of contract that would define a CEO's legacy. Vincent had been working on this relationship for almost a year. It was his baby. His big win. But Meridian was hesitant. They'd gone through 3 different account managers at our company already. They were tired of inconsistency. They were tired of dealing with people who didn't understand their business. Meridian needed someone who would be there for the long term. Someone they could trust. Someone who would remember that their founder's name was spelled Cynthia, not Cindy, because details mattered. That person was me. I knew this because I'd been the original account manager on the Meridian relationship. Before Brandon was even hired, I'd spent months building trust with their team. I knew their pain points. I knew their goals. I knew that what they really wanted was a partner, not a vendor. When Vincent asked me to support Brandon's pitch to Meridian, I said yes. But I had conditions. I told Vincent that Meridian was sensitive about consistency, and they'd need to see me at the meeting to confirm that the company understood the importance of this relationship. Vincent agreed. He was desperate. The deal was slipping. He needed whatever advantage he could get. That meeting became the turning point. Brandon presented a strategy that was generic and uninspired. I listened politely. Then I added some thoughts. Thoughts that showed I understood Meridian's unique challenges. Thoughts that showed I'd been paying attention to how their industry was changing. Thoughts that made it clear I wasn't just a vendor. I was a partner. Meridian's CEO, a woman named Cynthia, pulled me aside after the meeting. "Paula, would you be my direct contact on this if we move forward?" she asked. I hesitated. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed her to understand the significance of what she was asking. "Cynthia, I need to be honest with you. My role has changed at the company. I'm no longer in operations. I'm transitioning to a more advisory position." She blinked. "But you're still here, right? You'll still be involved?" "Yes," I said. "I'll be here." That simple answer changed everything. Cynthia called Vincent the next day. The message was clear. They would do the deal, but only if I was the primary contact. Only if they had consistency. Only if they had me. Vincent had no choice. He agreed. He had to. The Meridian contract was too important. But he also knew what this meant. He'd demoted me, and now he needed me more than ever. I could see the frustration in his face when he told me the news. "Paula, Meridian has requested you as their lead contact. I know your role has changed, but would you be willing to take this on?" I smiled. Not the predator smile. The honest smile. "Of course, Vincent. Whatever the company needs." But what he didn't understand was that this wasn't about the company anymore. This was about me. This was about showing the investors exactly what would happen if they bet on me instead of on him. This was about proving that his son was unnecessary. That his nepotism was unnecessary. That I was the only irreplaceable piece. Over the next month, I worked that Meridian contract like my life depended on it. Because in some ways, it did. I implemented every suggestion they mentioned. I anticipated problems before they surfaced. I built a team that was responsive, creative, and completely aligned with Meridian's vision. Brandon was supposed to be managing the overall project. But he'd essentially disappeared. He was busy working on other deals that were slowly falling apart under his leadership. The more time he spent away from Meridian, the more it became clear that I was the one running the show. Cynthia started calling me directly with questions. Not Brandon. Me. And when she called me, I answered. I didn't delegate. I didn't pass things up the chain. I solved her problems in real time. That was the difference between me and Brandon. I understood that client relationships weren't about hierarchy. They were about responsiveness. They were about showing up. They were about caring enough to remember that someone took their coffee black, not with cream. Brandon cared about titles. I cared about results. By the end of month 2 of the Meridian contract, they'd already expanded the scope by $15 million. That never would have happened with Brandon in charge. It happened because I understood what they needed before they did. I delivered what they asked for before they asked for it. I anticipated their problems and solved them preemptively. That's what leadership actually looks like. That's what Vincent had thrown away when he demoted me. The Meridian contract was set to close in week 3 of month 4. I was organizing the final presentation, the legal reviews, the implementation timeline. Everything was perfect. Everything was aligned. Vincent was nervous. Not about the contract closing, we all knew it would close. He was nervous because he finally understood what he'd done. He'd demoted the only person holding his company together, and now his company was entirely dependent on that person staying. He called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. Brandon wasn't there. This was just him and me. "Paula, I've made some decisions about restructuring the leadership team." I waited. I didn't say anything. Silence is a weapon when used correctly. "I'm going to create a new position. Chief Strategy Officer. Reporting directly to me. I'd like you to take it." I'd expected this. But I still felt the weight of it. He was offering me a lifeline. An escape route. A way back to legitimacy. And he was doing it because he understood that without me, everything would collapse. "Vincent, that's generous," I said carefully. "But I need to think about it. I need to understand what my actual responsibilities would be. What my authority would be. Who I'd be managing. What decisions I'd have control over." His face tightened. He'd expected me to jump at the offer. Instead, I was negotiating. From a position of strength. "We can work out the details," he said. "The important thing is bringing you back into a leadership position. I'll let you know after the Meridian contract closes," I said. "Let's see how things settle." That same Thursday evening, I met with Thomas, the investor who'd been quietly concerned about Vincent's leadership. We met at a coffee shop near the office, the kind of place where no one would recognize us. I didn't ask him to betray anyone. I didn't ask him to do anything except listen. I told him about the current state of the company. The contracts that were struggling because of Brandon's poor decisions. The clients that were considering leaving. The operational issues that were mounting. The only reason things weren't falling apart completely, I explained, was because I'd been managing the fallout from my new advisory role. I didn't have to tell him that Vincent had also just offered me a new position. He understood the subtext. I was being kept on a short leash. I was being offered just enough to stay, but not enough to actually lead. And every month I stayed in that situation, the company would slowly deteriorate. "What would you do?" Thomas asked me directly. "If you had the authority, what would you change?" I thought about it. I'd been thinking about it for 4 months. I'd put myself back in operations. I'd move Brandon to a role where he could learn without destroying the company. And I'd restructure the investor relationships so that decisions go through a management committee instead of through one person. Thomas nodded slowly. "And if the current leadership wouldn't let you do that?" "Then I'd have to consider my options," I said quietly. "And I think other investors might want to know about those options." He understood exactly what I was saying. I wasn't threatening to leave. I was offering him an alternative path forward. I was offering to lead the company the way it should be led, but I needed investor backing to do it. The conversation ended there. But something shifted. I could feel it. The Meridian contract closed on Monday of week 3 in month 4. $50 million over 5 years. It was the largest contract the company had ever signed. Vincent threw a celebration. An actual party. Everyone got drunk and congratulated Brandon on his leadership. Brandon accepted the congratulations. He looked uncomfortable, but he accepted them. Vincent gave a speech about vision and innovation and the importance of bringing in fresh perspectives. He didn't mention me once. Not once. I stood in the corner of the room, watching this happen, and I felt nothing. Not anger. Not hurt. Just clarity. This was the moment. Everything I'd built, everything I'd planned, everything I'd worked for over the last 4 months came down to this moment. Vincent had publicly taken credit for the Meridian contract. He'd publicly celebrated his son's leadership. And he'd publicly ignored the person who'd actually made it happen. That wasn't arrogance. That was stupidity. Because everyone in that room knew the truth. Cynthia Meridian had requested me personally. The contract expanded because of my involvement. The client was loyal to me, not to the company. And now Vincent had made it clear that he was willing to sacrifice my contributions for his son's ego. The next morning, I called Thomas. "I'm ready to discuss that alternative path," I said. "But we need to move quickly. And we need to be careful." The plan was simple, but it required perfect timing. Thomas and the other concerned investors, there were actually 5 of them, would formally request a board meeting. This board meeting would focus on company strategy and leadership effectiveness. Vincent couldn't refuse. He was legally obligated to hold these meetings. In the meeting, they would present data. Real, documented data about Brandon's performance. The contracts that were struggling. The client attrition. The operational issues. The declining project timelines. I'd compiled all of this data over the last 4 months. It was comprehensive and irrefutable. They would then propose bringing in an external consultant to evaluate the company's leadership structure. That consultant would be chosen by the investors. And they would recommend the restructuring I'd outlined. Vincent would have no choice but to agree, or he'd lose investor confidence completely. But here's where it gets interesting. Once the restructuring happened, once I was back in operations, I would have the authority to implement real change. And the first change would be moving Brandon into a junior position where he could learn without destroying anything. The second change would be reforming how decisions get made in this company, so no single person could ever make such a stupid choice again. The third change would be ensuring that I had a clear succession plan and the authority to choose it. Vincent had taught me something valuable when he demoted me. He taught me that titles don't matter. What matters is who actually controls the relationships and the operations. And I controlled both. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday of week 4. I spent that entire week documenting everything. Every client issue. Every operational problem. Every decision Brandon had made that had backfired. I prepared presentations that were clear, professional, and devastating. I didn't make them emotional. I made them factual. I made them the kind of presentations that a board couldn't ignore without looking incompetent themselves. The night before the meeting, Vincent called me at home. "Paula, Thomas mentioned something about an emergency board meeting. Do you know anything about this?" My heart rate didn't increase. My breathing didn't change. I'd expected this call. "Vincent, I don't have any information beyond what you probably already know. The investors want to discuss strategy." "Is this about the company, or is this about me?" he asked carefully. I could hear the fear in his voice. "It's about the company's future," I said, which was technically true. And who better to discuss that with than the people who've invested millions of dollars in it? He hung up. I knew he was panicking. He was calling other board members. He was trying to find out what was happening. And he was realizing that he'd lost control of the situation. That was exactly what I wanted him to feel. The board meeting was held in a conference room that felt colder than usual. Vincent sat at the head of the table, trying to look confident. Brandon wasn't there. Vincent had wisely decided to keep his son away from this. Thomas presented the data first. It was thorough. It showed that operations had declined since Brandon took over. It showed that project success rates had dropped. It showed that client satisfaction had decreased. Vincent tried to explain it away as market conditions, as external factors beyond anyone's control. Then the other investors spoke. They were professional but firm. The company needed better leadership. The current structure wasn't working. They needed an evaluation. Vincent fought back. He argued that these things took time. That Brandon was still learning. That I shouldn't have allowed the operations to slip. He tried to blame me for the problems his son had created. That was his second major mistake. Because when he blamed me, the investors asked the obvious question: if Paula Rice is responsible for operations, why did you demote her? Vincent had no good answer. He demoted me to protect his son, and everyone in that room knew it. The investors voted to bring in an external consultant. Vincent voted against it. His one vote didn't matter. The consultant was scheduled to begin the evaluation the following week. Vincent left the meeting looking like a man whose world was collapsing. He didn't say anything to me. He just walked past, and I watched him go. The external consultant was a woman named Margaret who specialized in evaluating corporate leadership structures. I met with her for 3 hours on Monday morning. I didn't sell her on anything. I just answered her questions honestly. I told her about my background, my experience, my vision for the company. I showed her the data I'd compiled. She took notes. She asked follow-up questions. She was smart. She understood what was really happening here. On Tuesday, she met with Brandon. He spent the entire time making excuses. The market was tough. The clients were unrealistic. The operations team didn't understand innovation. He blamed everyone but himself. Margaret had seen this before. She recognized arrogance when she saw it. By Wednesday, she met with Vincent. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know Vincent came out looking defeated. Thursday was the final day of her evaluation. She submitted her report to the board. The report was clear. The company needed structural changes. Brandon was not ready for a leadership position. He needed mentorship and training. The consultant recommended that I return to my previous role as Vice President of Operations, with expanded authority. She also recommended that Brandon be moved to a Director of Development position, where he could learn from experienced leaders. Finally, she recommended that a management committee be formed to make major decisions, so no single person could make unilateral choices that affected the company's direction. The investors voted. The vote was unanimous. Everything the consultant recommended would be implemented. Vincent called me into his office the morning after the vote. He looked defeated. Not angry. Just defeated. Paula, I'm sorry, he said, and I think he actually meant it. I made a mistake promoting Brandon so quickly. I let my desire to provide for my son cloud my judgment about what was best for the company. I could have said a lot of things. I could have reminded him how much he'd hurt me. I could have made him feel every bit of the pain I'd felt when he demoted me. Instead, I said, "What's done is done, Vincent. The important thing now is making sure the company moves forward in the right direction." He looked relieved. He thought I was being gracious. He didn't understand that I was just being practical. Revenge would have felt good for about 5 minutes. Building something better would feel good forever. "You're back as VP of Operations, effective immediately," he said. "The consultant's recommendations are being implemented. And Paula, I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your leadership going forward." I nodded. I didn't thank him. I didn't celebrate. I just accepted the position like it was something I'd always had the right to. Because I did. Vincent had never should have taken it away. By Friday, I was back in my old office. My old desk. with my old authority. Except I wasn't the same person who'd sat there before. I was harder. I was smarter. I was someone who understood exactly how corporate politics worked. And I understood exactly how to win them. My first week back in operations, I made strategic changes. I moved the best project managers to the contracts that were struggling. I realigned the team structure so that communication flowed more efficiently. I implemented new client management protocols that prioritized consistency and responsiveness. The changes were smooth. There was no drama. There was no rebellion. Everyone understood that these changes made sense. Everyone understood that I knew what I was doing. Brendan was moved to the Director of Development position. I set up a mentorship program for him. A real one. Not a charity case. He was going to learn how to run a business from the ground up. He was going to understand operations, client relationships, and the actual work that made the company function. If he could learn, he could eventually become a real leader. If he couldn't, he would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of nepotism. Either way, the company was going to be fine. More than fine. Within 3 weeks of being back in operations, project success rates started climbing. Within 6 weeks, client satisfaction scores improved by 30%. Within 2 months, 3 of the clients who'd been considering leaving came back with expanded contracts. Vincent watched all of this happen. He watched his company stabilize under my leadership. He watched his son become an actual human being instead of a trophy. He watched the investors smile at board meetings for the first time in months. And he understood, finally, what he'd lost when he demoted me. He also understood what he'd gained by bringing me back. That was worth more than any apology. 3 months after I returned to operations, the Meridian contract was thriving. Cynthia called me directly. She wanted to expand the scope another $30 million. She wanted to add new services. She wanted to deepen the partnership. She wanted to do all of this because she trusted me. Because she knew that when she called me with a problem, I would solve it. Not in a week. Not in a day. In the time it took to have the conversation. That's what client relationships actually looked like. That's what Vincent had been missing. He'd been so focused on impressing investors and building a legacy that he'd forgotten about the actual work. He'd forgotten that a business is built on relationships, not on org charts. He'd forgotten that the people who do the work are more important than the people who claim to lead it. By the end of month 6 of my return to operations, the company was on track for its best year ever. Revenue was up 35%. Client retention was at 94%. Employee satisfaction had increased dramatically. And the investors were so happy that they were talking about expanding their investment in the company. Vincent saw all of this. And he finally, truly understood what he'd done when he demoted me. More importantly, he understood what it meant that I'd chosen to come back. I could have left. I could have started my own company. I could have taken every client with me and built a competitor that would have destroyed everything he'd built. I had all the leverage. I had all the relationships. I had all the skills. But I didn't do that. I stayed. And I built something better. That was my revenge. Not destruction. Construction. Building something so good that his mistakes became irrelevant. Building something so strong that his nepotism couldn't touch it. Building something so perfect that my leadership became undeniable. Vincent called me into his office on a Friday afternoon in month 7. I knew what was coming. I'd been expecting it for weeks. "Paula, I want to talk about succession planning," he said. "I'm not getting any younger. And I think it's time to start thinking about who leads this company after I step back." I waited. I let him continue. "I'd like you to be the next CEO." "Not immediately." But within the next 2 years, you'd be ready to take over completely. I sat back in my chair. This was everything I'd worked for. This was the ultimate vindication. This was the moment where his complete failure to understand people and business would finally cost him everything. I need to think about it, I said. Vincent blinked. He'd expected me to jump at the offer. He'd expected gratitude. Instead, I was considering. Take your time, he said carefully. But Paula, I think you know this is the best outcome for everyone. I know it's the right outcome for the company, I said. But I need to understand what it means for me. What kind of authority I'd have as CEO. What kind of governance structure would be in place. Whether I'd have the ability to make the changes I think need to happen. Vincent nodded. He understood that I wasn't the person he'd demoted anymore. He understood that I was someone who asked hard questions. Someone who demanded clarity. Someone who wasn't going to just accept a title and hope everything worked out. We talked for another hour about what CEO would mean. About my vision for the company. About the changes I wanted to implement. By the end of the conversation, Vincent was convinced that I was the right person. And I was convinced that the position would be good for me. But I also understood something that Vincent didn't. As CEO, I wouldn't just run the company. I would own it. I would have the authority to make decisions that affected not just the business, but Vincent's legacy. And that was the ultimate victory. I became CEO 2 years later, exactly as planned. The transition was smooth. I didn't fire Vincent. I moved him to Chairman Emeritus, a position that honored his contributions while removing him from day-to-day operations. Brendan, who'd actually learned something during his time in development, became Director of New Business Development. It wasn't a leadership position. But it was a position where he could contribute without causing damage. The company continued to grow. New contracts came in. New clients came in. New revenue streams opened up. By the time I'd been CEO for 1 year, the company's valuation had doubled. The investors were thrilled. Vincent watched all of this from his emeritus position. He'd built a company worth $50 million. Now it was worth $100 million. And he knew that it was worth that because of me. Because he'd demoted me and I'd proven that I was irreplaceable. Because he'd tried to protect his son and I'd shown that nepotism doesn't work. Because he'd underestimated me and I'd built something so good that his mistakes became lessons for everyone. That was the real revenge. Not destruction. But building something so extraordinary that his original betrayal became a story about how he accidentally created the circumstances that led to his own ascension. He went down in history not as the CEO who nearly destroyed the company through nepotism, but as the CEO who had the wisdom to recognize he was wrong and step back. That's a better legacy than he deserved. But it's the legacy I gave him anyway. I made my first major decision as CEO, and it was significant. I instituted a strict anti-nepotism policy. No family members could work in the company. No exceptions. Not for Vincent's relatives. Not for anyone else's. The company was going to be built on merit, not on bloodlines. Vincent tried to object. He said it was unfair to ban people from working at a family business just because of who they were related to. I reminded him of something he'd conveniently forgotten. This isn't a family business, Vincent. It's a business that a family happens to own. And for a business to survive, it has to be run by the most capable people. Not by the people with the best genetics. The policy stood. And it did something remarkable. It sent a message to every employee in the company. Merit mattered. Hard work mattered. Capability mattered. It mattered more than who your parents were or who you knew or what family you were born into. Suddenly, the best people in the industry wanted to work for us. They wanted to be part of a company that actually valued them for what they could do, not for who they were related to. Within 6 months of implementing the policy, we'd hired 12 new executives, all of them the absolute best in their fields. The company continued to grow. By the end of year 2 of my tenure as CEO, we'd opened a second office. By year 3, we were profitable in a way that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Vincent came to see me in my office one afternoon. He looked old. Not physically, but mentally. He looked like a man who'd spent years understanding that he'd nearly destroyed something valuable because of his ego. "Paula, I want to apologize," he said. "Not just for the demotion. For everything. For not seeing your value. For not protecting this company the way I should have. For letting my personal desires cloud my judgment about what was best for the business." I could have thrown it in his face. I could have reminded him of exactly how much it had hurt. I could have made him feel the weight of his mistake. Instead, I did something different. "Vincent, you taught me something valuable," I said. "You taught me that the most important thing in business is understanding people. Understanding what they want. Understanding what they fear. Understanding what they're capable of. You didn't understand those things about me. And that cost you. But I learned from it. And that made me a better leader." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad something good came out of my mistake." "Something good came out of everyone's mistakes," I said. "Including mine. Including yours. The question is whether we learn from them." By year 4 of my tenure as CEO, the company had expanded to 3 offices. We'd hired 200 new employees. We'd launched 5 new service lines. We'd become one of the most respected companies in our industry. Clients requested us specifically. Employees requested us. Other companies tried to imitate what we were doing. None of them succeeded. Because what we built wasn't something that could be copied. It was something that had to be earned. It was built on relationships. It was built on trust. It was built on understanding that the people who do the work are more valuable than the people who claim to lead it. Vincent stepped down completely in year 4. Not because I forced him, but because he understood that it was time. The company had moved beyond him. Not because I'd destroyed him, but because I'd built something so good that his old way of doing things became irrelevant. He maintained a position on the board of directors. He got paid well for it. He got to watch the company he'd founded thrive. But he no longer had any real authority. That authority belonged to me. That authority belonged to people who'd earned it. I often thought about that moment in the boardroom when Vincent told me I was being demoted. I thought about the anger I'd felt. The rage. The sense of injustice. All of those emotions had been real. All of them had been justified. But none of them had been the force that drove me forward. What drove me forward was something colder. Something more strategic. Something that understood that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's success. It's building something so good that the person who betrayed you has to watch you build it, and has to acknowledge that you were right all along. It's walking past them every day knowing that they understand what they lost. That's a revenge that lasts forever. That's a revenge that doesn't destroy anyone. That's a revenge that just makes everyone better. I stood in my office on the top floor of our newest building, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, competitors were trying to figure out what we were doing right. Somewhere, other companies were trying to copy our model. Somewhere, other CEOs were wondering why they couldn't recruit the same talent we could recruit. None of them understood the real secret. The secret wasn't strategy. The secret wasn't innovation. The secret was that I'd built a company where people mattered. Where relationships mattered. Where loyalty was earned and reciprocated. Where doing good work was recognized and rewarded. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. I'd learned it when someone I trusted betrayed me. I'd learned it when someone with less capability was given authority because of who they were born to. I'd learned it when I had to choose between destruction and construction. I chose construction. And that choice, more than anything else, was why I'd won. Not because I was smarter than Vincent, though I was. Not because I was more capable than Brandon, though I was. But because I understood something fundamental about human nature that they never would. People want to follow someone they trust. People want to work for someone who sees them. People want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And if you can give them that, if you can build an organization where those things are true, then there's no limit to what you can accomplish. I didn't beat Vincent by destroying him. I beat him by building something so good that he couldn't help but respect me. And that's a victory that will last longer than any revenge ever could. Kindly like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy for more intriguing stories. The end.